Hey everybody, welcome back to Video. So here I got a fun episode for you guys this Friday because you've all been asking whether or not I'm going to test a Raspberry Pi 5 on the channel and talk about the improvements in emulators that we're struggling to run on the Raspberry Pi 4. Because for $80, the Raspberry Pi 5 is an absolute emulation beast, and I did want to get one set up, but I got this right after Christmas. Took me a minute to find one in stock, and I forgot to do it for a few weeks. This is a little bit delayed, but it is worth it because when I tell you the Raspberry Pi 5 is such an evolutionary jump in power and compatibility over the Raspberry Pi 4, I 100% mean it. Things are running stable on this that never ran stable on my Raspberry Pi 4 before. But let's pop right into the box. We're going to do a very quick build, talk about my setup, and get right into the testing. But I found it absolutely hilarious that there is no anti-static bag in this box. I don't know if they forgot it. I haven't asked anyone who got one, but it is just a bare board sitting in cardboard. I've never seen that before. Maybe they just missed it, or maybe it's a cost-saving measure to keep the cost of the board down. Whatever happened, the board was totally fine, and it is here in front of us. And just like every other Raspberry Pi unit before it, it is absolutely tiny, and it is shocking how much power can fit into such a small space. Having grown up in the late 80s and early 90s, computers used to be massive and did basically nothing, and now we have something that can emulate Dreamcast, PlayStation Portable, Sega Saturn, something that can fit in the palm of your hand. The I/O is great for USB ports with that Ethernet. You do need a special power adapter if you want to have all of the power over the USB ports, and those adapters can be even harder to find than the Raspberry Pi 5 itself right now. I was able to locate one, but you can use a Raspberry Pi 4 as well. And you'll see here that it does use a tiny little HDMI cable, so be prepared for that. If you don't have one of those in your drawer, pick one up. And just so you know, all of the tests in this video are done at stock. I do have active cooling with a fan as heat sinking into the aluminum case, so I probably could overclock the Raspberry Pi 5. And when you try to plug a fan header in, be aware that there is a little cap over this before you actually get to insert anything. Tricked me a few times. I was trying to find out why it didn't fit. It is absolutely minuscule. But honestly, the Raspberry Pi 5 is so tiny, it's going to be a lot of fun to see what this thing is capable of in the future. Now be aware I am using a beta of Recalbox for this video. It is not finalized, and pretty much nothing about this is final. And so many of the most popular OSs for the Raspberry Pi don't yet have a released working version for the Pi 5, so you should really consider this a worst case scenario test. I have not done anything to emulation to make it work any better than out of the box. This is a raw horsepower test, just seeing how these games run without touching anything whatsoever. I just want to see what the chipset, what the CPU, and everything else on the Raspberry Pi 5 can do when we actually get into emulators that I feel like the Raspberry Pi 4 would struggle at. And we're going to move right into Dead or Alive 2. This is on the Sega Dreamcast. And I will say all the way through at stock rendering resolution 640 by 480 on that VGA style resolution, I had rock solid stable Dreamcast emulation the whole way through in the games that I am familiar with and I test. I will tell you when I up the internal rendering resolution. I'll tell you when we start to lose some frames. I will turn the frame counter on soon, but I want this to be more of a look and feel test. Dead or Alive 2 here is just absolutely fluid and absolutely smooth. We're still at 640 by 480, but I'm going to jump up in resolution. Once you see the next clip, I will tell you when. But this was a game on my Raspberry Pi 4 that I would definitely feel like it started to hitch a little bit. It's the type of game, being a fast-paced 3D fighting game, you want 60 frames per second, you want fluidity, you don't want any stutters in your gameplay whatsoever. And that is what I'm getting out of the Raspberry Pi 5 with changing nothing. Now we've jumped up one resolution bump, and again still, outside of stock resolutions, the Raspberry Pi is 100% holding up in this game. Now I did find that other games would definitely start dropping frames once you left 640 by 480, but getting Dreamcast running at standard resolution for the hardware on the Raspberry Pi 5 with a perfect lock frame rate was just absolutely spectacular. Now we're going to jump up one more resolution bump right here. We're going to go to 1440 by 1080, and you're going to see that it starts to drop a frame here and there. There's ever so much of a slight stagger. Again, no frame counter yet, just watch the cadence of the footage. But I would still call this infinitely playable, but dropping down one bump in internal rendering resolution gives you that rock solid 60 frames per second. Now moving over to Sonic Adventure 2, this is running at 640 by 480. It is such a bright, vibrant game that honestly, internally upscaling it doesn't really do that much in my opinion. And again, this is a game that is running at its native frame rate locked with absolutely no issues whatsoever. And I remember on my Raspberry Pi 4, I would notice micro stutters. And that's why these tests are so fun. This is just bone stock on a beta operating system with no changes to the emulation whatsoever outside of just the resolution. And the audio is as good as the visuals. Go ahead and listen, and I'll be right back with more footage. The reason I gave you a sound sample there is because sometimes when emulators will start to drop frames, they can also start stuttering their audio, and that audio sounded crystal clear. Obviously, Dreamcast emulation is very far advanced, and you should expect good sound quality coming out, but if it does start to drop frames or screw up on the emulation, you can start hearing that sometimes as well as seeing it. But from the first level of Sonic Adventure 2, I cannot tell anything in the performance that would lead me to believe that there is any issue of the horsepower of the Raspberry Pi 5. Now, of course, Dreamcast is a very big library. I'm just testing games I'm familiar with that I've tested before, but as far as Dreamcast performance so far is concerned, it has been a 10 out of 10 rock solid experience on the Raspberry Pi 5. Now moving over to Power Stone, this is a game where upping the internal rendering resolution whatsoever, at least on this Recalbox installation, seems to then slow the frame rate down. We'll get to the frame counter very shortly, but again, I just want to do this off look and feel. I think that if you just watch footage, you can tell when it's running well versus when it's not. I don't like when people focus just on a numerical value, but we will be there in just a moment. But as I switch to the next clip, you're going to very quickly see the game is going to slow down and it's going to start to stutter. This is one step above 640 by 480, and at least for Power Stone, the Raspberry Pi 5 couldn't do it outside of internal rendering resolution. But I remember when I tested this game on the 4, I think it was dropping frames at the stock resolution on an overclocked Raspberry Pi 4, so this is just so much more improved. But let's move over to another system that is fun time and 3D. That's going to be the PlayStation Portable. I love PSP, I love PSP emulation, whether it's on my Steam Deck or on real hardware. I wanted to see what Tekken 6 would do because I feel like this game is really willing to up its internal rendering resolution and continue to run at a good frame rate. So I wanted to see just how far I could push this game on the Raspberry Pi 5, and the good thing is, I could push it very far. I'm starting with the native resolution. You can see that it is not high res whatsoever, but it is running perfectly fine. And this is exactly the experience you would expect if you were playing this game on a real PlayStation Portable, except it would look clearer because the screen would be much smaller. But every round I'm going to up the resolution, I'm going to show you what it is, and you're going to see how it behaves. And I will turn on the frame counter now as well. So let's pop over to 2x internal rendering resolution and see how that behaves. And you'll see when we get in game, it is much clearer, and the frame counter is a lock 60 out of 60, 100% speed. It might drop down to 99.9, but that's just a fluctuation in how the hardware works. That is not the game really struggling whatsoever to run in 2x. And this is definitely a fast, fluid game, and again, fighting games are great to test when you're looking for latency or drop frames because so much of what is important here is the performance. So now let's pop back in and let's go to 3x internal rendering resolution. This is 3 times the pixels that would be going on real hardware, and again you can see it is a lock 60 frames per second. This is absolutely stunning. It looks great captured via my RetroTink, it looks great on my television, and the performance and gameplay is just 100% here at 3x internal scale. And I did check my Raspberry Pi 4, I could barely get off the 1x mode. So let's jump up one more setting and see if it can actually handle 4x. Now again, remember, I am doing nothing for these emulators, I am not changing any settings, I'm just seeing what they do out of the box. So if you actually tweaked a bunch of stuff, you could probably even get more power out of the Raspberry Pi 5. And again, this is on a beta operating system, and a lot of these emulators might need some updates. You will see here we have just dropped down to 38 to 39 frames per second. So at least in Tekken 6, a 4x internal rendering resolution was not within the realm of the Raspberry Pi 5 today. But with emulator updates, with an overclock, with an operating system that's not in beta, it's possible that we could get there on Tekken 6. So just remember, again, I'm just seeing what I can brute force this thing to do without getting into any of the nitty gritty. And if we jump back down to 3x, we're back at a lock 60 frames a second, and honestly after 3x you don't really see much of a difference in the visual unless you're on a 4K monitor, so just be aware of that. Now moving over to Ultimate Ghosts and Goblins here, this is a game again that on the Raspberry Pi 4 I couldn't really get it to run at a lock stable frame rate. Now this is at 2x internal rendering resolution and it is not running well here whatsoever. This is the thing, not every single PSP game is going to give you that resolution bump. Sometimes you need to drop it back down to native resolutions. As you're seeing here, we're running at 13 frames per second out of 30, which is what the game would be locked at. But if we jump down to 1x internal rendering resolution, you're going to see we're now at a locked 30 frames a second. This was performance that was not easy to get out of the Raspberry Pi 4, but here on the Pi 5, you're just getting it all the time. Of the games I tested for PSP, I was not able to find a game at least at 1x resolution that would not run at a native frame rate, and that is just spectacular. And of course, it's still the early days, and I haven't tested the entire PlayStation Portable library, but I would be surprised if you could find a game that would be not playable on the current hardware, and that is also the great thing. So many people don't even have Raspberry Pi 5s yet. So many emulator developers, so many operating system makers haven't even really gotten much of the hardware in their hands, so it's only going to get better from here. And some games you definitely can get to the 4x rendering resolution scale, and I will move over right now to Me and My Katamari. This is a game that is running at 4x, and at least in the intro area here, it is running at a rock solid frame rate. Now I'm sure as you get into the game and the print starts rolling up a lot more stuff, you might need to dial it back to 3x, but you can see here just how good this looks when that rendering resolution is bumped. Sure, some of the 2D assets aren't going to look anywhere near as good as the 3D, but this just looks absolutely spectacular. It is a 10 out of 10 in my opinion, and PlayStation Portable performance on the Raspberry Pi 5 is so much improved from the Raspberry Pi 4. It is night and day different and so much worth the upgrade. Now let's move over to the Sega Saturn, a notoriously difficult console to emulate. It's not because the CPUs are particularly fast or it's a particularly high test system. It is a highly complicated system, a mess of silicon, and Sega did so many different things with the hardware that emulation still to this day is a work in progress because it is that complicated of a system. And on the Raspberry Pi 4, last time I remember playing Sega Saturn, I wouldn't really call it a super playable experience. But here in Panzer Dragoon, and I will turn the frame counter on in just a second, but again, look at the screen cadence. This is running smoothly. There's definitely some emulation glitches here and there, and I'm sure that I could probably move around to different emulators, but again, I am just seeing what the day one brute force method of performance is, and I am just so impressed with what we're getting here. And before you ask, I did test PlayStation 2 and I did test GameCube, and for the life of me, I could not get them to work whatsoever. I know other people have gotten it done, but I just wanted to kind of play around and see what was possible. So as this project matures, as Raspberry Pi 5 support gets more robust, I will definitely come back in and take a closer look. But you'll see here in Panzer Dragoon with the frame counter at the top, again, it is just a lock 60 frames per second. Sure, it fluctuates up and down a tiny bit, that is normal, but this game right here is just running exactly speed-wise as you would expect out of this game. And if for any reason you've never played Panzer Dragoon before, definitely go ahead and give it a shot wherever you played on. It is one of my favorite Sega Saturn games of all time. But again, this is a game that would be hitchy and underperform if you didn't have the hardware needed to run it. And that is what I'm finding out about the Raspberry Pi 5 right now. Everything I throw at it, as long as the emulation is currently working on the system, it is running extremely well. And as we move into the building here, you're going to see even the transition, we're not really dropping any frames in whatsoever when it's loading in a new area. Watch that counter, it stays at 59.77 and we just continue on with the game. That is great performance. This is 100% a playable experience, even if there are some visual glitches, and even if I could pop over to a different version of the Saturn emulator, maybe we might get a little bit less of a glitch. This is the fun part though, just seeing what is possible and what can be done. And don't worry, we're going to be taking a closer look at some other Saturn games as well in this video, because I did want to see how they performed. But everything here in Panzer Dragoon is just so smooth. It's buttery, silky smooth as far as the gameplay and the footage is concerned. And as far as the latency, I didn't officially test that, but I had no issues in any of the fighting games I was playing, so honestly the latency shouldn't matter whatsoever either on most emulation. But again, with everything going on screen, with it drawing this big ship, the open water and the sky, I can't make it drop a frame. Now let's move over to something like Virtua Fighter 2, a game again in the fighting genre that if it is slowing down and not working correctly, you're definitely going to feel it. And this runs at an interlace mode, so it can get a higher resolution, but it should run at a 60 frame per second clip. And you're going to see here again 59.99 to 60.00 locked. No issues whatsoever. It is smooth, it's responsive, it's exactly how you would want Virtua Fighter 2 to be emulating on something like a Raspberry Pi 5. And I understand there's a lot of different ways to emulate Saturn. Steam Deck is very popular as well, and that obviously is going to have a lot more performance than the Raspberry Pi 5. But for the $80 bill, this thing is going to run you. The performance to dollar ratio is just off the charts. This might be the easiest, cheapest way to get this sort of Saturn performance out of an emulator or Dreamcast or even PSP. And I know it isn't really ready for prime time yet setup wise, but you can get some betas of operating systems that are in testing right now, and you can check them out. As we move on to the second stage here, again, everything I did on Sega Saturn, I could not get it to run anything less than full speed. Now, of course, there's a lot of games in the library. Maybe there's one out there that isn't working, so tell me down below if you've been playing around with your Pi 5 and what games do and don't work for you. And as far as my favorite Sega Saturn game of all time, Saturn Bomberman, it just works. Now, this is not a heavy test game. It's not pushing the Saturn hardware to its limits, and it's not a game that you would expect to be dropping frames because it's not really doing that much heavy lifting. But it is a game I've played so many different times in my life over the last 20 years, and it is my favorite Sega Saturn game. So if there was anything wrong with the performance whatsoever, I would intrinsically be able to tell the minute I start playing it. This is a 10 out of 10 fun time on Raspberry Pi 5. I've got zero complaints about anything on the Sega Saturn side that I've tested so far. Now, moving over to Nintendo 64, this is a system that I just would not recommend on Raspberry Pi 4. It never really worked well for me, and here, interestingly enough, it is running the game, but there's a big white screen over the top. Once I quit out of the emulator back to the Recalbox home screen, you can see that it's slightly running underneath. You get a little glimpse of the emulator, so I'm sure this is just down to something on the operating system update side or on the emulator side, because again, this is not prime time. This is not ready for public consumption. These are all beta operating systems. You saw that little flash of Bomberman there. And to be aware, at least on Recalbox, it puts up bezels. I absolutely hate them. And there's more than one beta as far as what you can put on your Raspberry Pi. I could have gone with Bacotera, and I'm waiting to see when the RetroPie guys get out a Raspberry Pi 5 image. Maybe they've already done it. Maybe it's buried in a forum somewhere. That is how early it is here on Raspberry Pi 5. But the performance on Dreamcast, PSP, and Sega Saturn was spectacular, and that is worth the price of $80 alone. I will definitely check out GameCube and PlayStation 2 once I'm actually able to get them running, but I know you guys have been asking about the Pi 5, so I figured I would run with what I have here, because you know I love my Dreamcast, my PlayStation Portable, and especially my Sega Saturn. But yeah, if you can find a Raspberry Pi 5 in stock, definitely pick one up. Don't pay scalper prices, it's not worth that. Bye-bye.